Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more conversations in the digital age. 2016 was by any standard an unmitigated disaster from the perspective of liberals, progressives, and Democrats. As Ariel Dorfman characterized the 2016 election and the current issue of the nation, it was the election that elevated to the presidency an archetypal liar and devious imposter who has hoodwinked and mesmerized his way into power. The November election put Trump and Pence in charge of a chaotic, dysfunctional White House, firing government officials right and left, setting an ultra-right conservative agenda with reproductive rights, universal health care, bank regulation, immigration fairness, voting rights, and environmental protection, all heading for the chopping block. Republicans control both houses of Congress, with Democrats having little hope of a reversal of fortune. In 2018, 31 Senate seats will be in contention, but the GOP will be defending only 8 of them, while the Democrats must fight to hold 23. To make matters worse for the left, Republican governors now sit in 33 of the 50 state houses, and Republicans now dominate roughly 67% of the state legislatures. There's a 5-4 Republican-appointed majority on the Supreme Court, with the prospect of more Trump appointees filling numerous existing vacancies in the federal judiciary. How does the left propose to counter this disastrous turn of events? With us to give us some insights is Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation, the oldest continuously published weekly magazine in the United States and our country's widest read periodical of liberal and progressive thinking. Katrina, you are most welcome.
Thank you, Jim, for having me on after that opening statement. Don't know where to head. I know we have a lot of work to do.
A lot of work.
A lot of work. I mean, I think what we saw in 2016, if I could step back, is this, someone like Trump doesn't arise or get elected if this country isn't already in crisis. Something that Senator Elizabeth Warren said at a conference I was at a few months ago. Let me just, identify a few things. I mean, a lot of people in this country have seen their living standards stagnate. An economy may boom, but they're not part of it. There's a lot of anger about not being heard, a lot of anger about a Washington that seems distant from people. So I think the Democrats and progressives, we're not in a sprint here. This is a marathon. This is a generational struggle to bring back a country whose, most Americans, if you really break down some of these issues, majorities of Americans are with progressives. But there are a lot of factors that get in the way. We can talk about that.
Don't you have the sense that we're kind of losing our way in America now, that that no one's at home in the government and our institutions are being undermined so seriously?
Well, I think we need to fix on the fact that the Trump administration has come in and wants to dismantle. You've heard it from Steve Bannon, dismantle the administrative state. That means basically putting in charge people of agencies and cabinet positions. They want to dismantle them. They want to roll back the civilizing advances of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. But Jim, I take heart, this country's waking up. I mean, the day after the inauguration, that badly attended inauguration, which we had to hear too much from Sean Spicer and Mr. Trump about the numbers, the size, there were millions of people. That was the largest political demonstration in U.S. history, if you looked at Washington and cities and states and communities around this country and the world. So I think people are waking up. Look at what's going on in the legal business with the travel ban. You had people in the streets, you had lawyers filing cases, and you had a court which is saying you're overreaching. So I think you're seeing, it's an overused term, but the resistance is vital, but we now need to go from resistance to rebuilding or resistance to reconstruction. And that's going to take a lot of organizing of the passions of people in the streets into electoral power, into organizing power, into building institutions. I think a lot of young people don't love institutions, but understand now they need to be part of institutions in a way they might not have. And that means digital institutions, too. I mean, the power of digital to bring people into the streets, but to organize them in districts around this country as we head into 2018. Some of your viewers may have heard of Indivisible, which is a very interesting group which came out of progressives in Congress watching the Tea Party, which I hate to emulate, but Democrats and progressives should emulate a little bit of the Tea Party and begin to run people in districts all across this country. There are groups like People's Action. There are groups like Democracy for America. There are groups like Working Families Party. So I'm just saying people and women. After the Women's March, Emily's List and Women We Lead, they're training thousands of women, recruiting them, training them, and running them. It's going to take a lot of work and patience, but it's beginning.
Well, you've mentioned a number of aspects of resistance,
yeah,
and a number of ways that people that don't agree with the direction we're headed in can express their views and influence the government. But how do we restore trust to a government which seems so grotesquely incompetent?
Well, I think part of the Trump agenda, Jim, is to demean government. I've always wondered, why do people who don't like government run to be in government, right? So we need to step back and retrieve some of our own history and understand.
Why are people who are pro-life like capital punishment?
I know. There's so many contradictions, but I do think we need to retrieve a sense that government is not an alien force. As Roosevelt said, government is us. Government should be about improving the condition of people's lives. I think we're sitting here, there's chaos, there's dysfunction, there's grotesquerie, as you described. This administration is malevolent, it's incompetent, sham populism, shameless plutocracy. But I think we need to begin to find a way to bring attention to the lived reality of people in this country and how Trump's budget, Trump's tax policies, Trump's labor policies, forgotten men and women remain forgotten in a Trump administration. His budget shafts disproportionately the very supporters in places like Kentucky or West Virginia. We need to bring attention to that, and we need to remind people of what good government is. It's tough because it's been polluted by money, big money. But I think one thing we're doing at the nation is we started a series called Cities Rising, and not just New York City or Los Angeles, but around this country, where they're incubating living wage projects, tackling inequality, paid family leave, sick leave. I mean, these are small things sometimes, but they're part of the fabric of people's lives. And I think you begin with that and find ways to speak to people and say you're on their side. Because Trump, he played that well, Jim. I mean, he played, I'm with you, forgotten men and women of America. We need, and I'm speaking of in the media, we have to get off our high horse and have a little more humility. I think it's a danger to continue to demonize Trump all the time. I think what we need to do is focus laser-like on how he's betraying his promises to those who voted for him, and not just resist, but say, hey, here's some things we want to do for you. So you can't just sit back and do resistance. There has to be a set of ideas and just what we're going to do to improve people's lives.
Do you believe it's for government to restore or correct income inequality? Or do you believe the private sector has to play a hand in this, and that CEOs and capitalists have to take part in that kind of a conversation?
So I'm a little heretical at the nation because I think often the left is too quick to put aside the private sector. I think we need to enlist, conscript the private sector in rebuilding America. The financialization of our economy, the maximization of shareholder profits at the expense of good companies or contributing to communities. There was a social compact. I'm being a little nostalgic maybe, but let's rebuild that social compact. And for example, where is Mr. Trump's infrastructure program? That was about putting people to work, and the private sector could play a constructive role, but it's not happening. Where's the jobs program?
But where was Mr. Obama's infrastructure program?
I think President Obama, his stimulus plan in many ways was underrated. It should have been bigger, and there should have been more demands on banks. They got away pretty scot-free, and there should have been a recapitalization of the housing industry and attention paid to people who were hurt in that financial crisis, desperately hurt. But Mr. Obama didn't do what he might have done with the tools he had. Now, he faced enormous obstruction, and
well, but
I
in
would
the
have
first 2 years he had a Democratic Congress.
But I would have.
So he started with Obamacare instead of starting with
He started without the
infrastructure.
jobs, without the jobs program, and that is an ongoing debate. And well, we can come to Obamacare today, but what I think was a problem was, you know, you had McConnell and I forget the other guy, but they said our first agenda is to make sure President Obama is a one-term president. Mr. Obama, President Obama, should have given them 2 weeks, not 2 years. And, you know, the attempt to work with them was so much part of his blue state, red state, we're all one state. In this country right now, I think we need fighters, we need leaders, we need people who will speak to a common good, not a partisan good, but who are ready to fight for people and make that clear. Now, I think that we're talking about the private sector. I do think government has a role to play. The tax policies of this country, I think, are crazy. I mean, why is it that a worker pays sort of the same tax level as someone who's, you know, on investment income? We're talking about carried interest. Your listeners, your viewers may know what that is, which benefits, you know, private equity, hedge fund. But we should go deeper and more systemic and basically tax people, tax work at the same rate as investment income. This is common sense. This is just, you know, basic fairness. So I think there's a lot, I think around the country, there are cities, Jim, where there are penalties if the gap between CEO pay ratio and worker ratio is more than 50 times.
It can be as much as 400 to 1.
I know, but 20 years ago, it was like 25. It's now 350 to 400 to 1.
But of course,
it's not healthy for a country. That's my, you know, my sense.
Well, but of course, investment income is taxed twice. It's taxed once at the corporate level and then once at the shareholder level.
Well, you tell me how many.
And who are these shareholders? They're not.
I know, that's
they're
right.
They're not plutocrats. They're maybe people who have their retirement savings in common.
Well, I've just assigned you. You asked me earlier about what the nation is doing. I think one of the next big crises in this country is retirement. I think we're going to see just a lot of cities and states unable to pay retirement, and what we need to do at the nation and in the nation is not just whine, but we should organize, but we should also begin to pull together ideas and policies that have concrete and real actionable input, so that one day, when the impossible becomes the inevitable politically, as I think it will, we have things to work with. Too often, our great contributor, Naomi Klein, wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine. I mean, Dick Cheney used 9/11, I believe, to take us into Iraq, which had been a long-time plan of the neocons. That is not a good plan to have on the shelf. We want to have plans on the shelf that will do some good for this country.
Well as a serious undermining of constitutional rights with detention,
torture,
without a hearing, torture, as well as eavesdropping that became.
Well, I'm struck because Comey, by the way, you know, former head of the FBI.
I'm glad you brought up quite timely.
But yeah, but he, you know, one of his better moments was when he rushed to Ashcroft's bedside, right?
Yes.
Because he wasn't going to go along with the Bush administration's attempt to extend warrantless wiretapping. So there are times when people stand up, and the question of that collision between Constitution and conscience and collusion, I think, faces us again today. And I think we need to have people who understand that the balance between security and liberty is one that can be attained, and that is the best of the American character. But boy, has it been off-kilter in these last years. And I think the Trump administration is a disgrace. I think it's dangerous. I think he's a homegrown authoritarian. I'm not as big a believer as some in the progressive liberal camp about the Russian influence. But I also think we can't forget, as I said earlier, that there's a continuum here. I don't forget the Bush-Cheney years and what was done to our country's civil liberties fabric, civil rights fabric, voting rights, which we see. We have an ace reporter, Ari Berman. That is an underreported story. Not now, certainly not after President Trump has now set up a voting integrity commission led by the king of voting suppression, Chris Kobach. So,
do you think voter suppression was a factor in?
I do. I think the hacking of black and brown votes, the hacking, voter suppression, I think was a serious issue in certainly a few of the states in 2016 and
although,
underreported.
Eddie Glaude Jr.,
Right.
who was the chairman of the African American Studies program at our mutual alma mater.
He's a wonderful
Princeton has been on the show, and he argues that blacks sat it out because they didn't believe that Obama and the Democrats had done anything for them in 8 years.
Well, when you look at those who voted for Obama in 2008 or 2012 who crossed over to Trump, it's interesting, but I think there was a sense of identity and pride in some of the vote, and certainly in 2008, African Americans coming out to vote and not feeling they had someone in Hillary Clinton who was going to, give them programs, policies, relief.
Well, they felt that
But I do think voting rights, I do think voting suppression. Let me ask you, Jim, why do you think Republicans have spent so much time? This was the first election, and this goes to both your specialty, the Supreme Court, and the states and the governors. This was the first election since the passage of the Voting Rights Act without full protection of the Voting Rights Act because of the Supreme Court and Shelby decision. And also it was the first time, I think, with 16 states with new voting restrictions.
Well, Shelby left in place the anti-discrimination provisions of the Voting Rights Act. They just said that Congress could not designate bad actor states where blacks had been elected to public office for years and then decide whether they'd be cleared or not, or subject to additional scrutiny.
I do think
so
voting...
it was a 5-4 decision. It was a political decision, without question. And this is one of the problems you probably go into at the nation, our partisan Supreme Court.
Well, this is your supremely partisan. I think one of the great mistakes progressives, liberals have made in the last 30, 40 years is failing to understand the power of the courts. And I don't need to tell you, the right has made it a focus. I think one of the reasons Donald Trump is president is his selection of Pence and his agreement with Cruz and others that he would select one of their people.
From lists supplied by the Federalist Society.
Thank you. The Federalist Society and the power of the Federalist Society. These are factors that progressives, until recently, have not understood the force and power of courts. And again, we're coming to it late, but we must now laser-like focus.
And we've seen that a lot of the saving grace may be in lower court federal judges who were not necessarily appointed by Republican presidents, although two Republican-appointed judges concurred in the Muslim ban decision in the Ninth Circuit, because they showed independence.
I think I do take some hope and strength from the resilience of our institutions. I understand that in the wake of the Trump election, there was talk of authoritarianism. How do you deal with tyrants and autocracy? There was a panic. And at the Nation, many of our young interns wept in the days after because they'd only lived under President Obama. We've seen, others, though we knew how bad it was. But I do think we need to rebuild understand the checks and balances. Well, and we see it with, I think with the FBI the firing of James Comey, you're going to have...
Do you think there's a constitutional crisis here? Is it something like the Saturday Night Massacre that we saw in the 70s?
Well, on some level, our good reporter Bruce Shapiro wrote the other day, it's worse because in the Saturday Night Massacre, you had a resistance. People were fired. Here you're seeing more collusion in a way with Trump's actions. The allocation of political blame is an ugly game to play, but it should be very clear who is stripping 24 million people of health care and tens of millions of the right to have health care without pre-existing condition discrimination. The implosion of the Democratic Party at the state level, President Obama should have noticed that one of his post-presidential jobs is working with former Attorney General Eric Holder to rebuild the Democratic Party at the state level. But it's going to take the work of others, too.
Well, let's talk about reproductive rights. Now, Jeffrey Stone says that Roe v. Wade has become the defining constitutional and political issue of our lifetime. And Roe v. Wade, face it, is in jeopardy. If Kennedy retires and he appoints someone like Gorsuch, it's in real jeopardy.
Yeah.
Now, Katha Pollitt, in a recent article in The Nation, said, well, perhaps Roe v. Wade isn't that important for liberals. They ought to be focusing on other issues. Do you agree with her?
You know, I agree with Katha on many things, but I think one fights to keep Roe v. Wade, and one also understands, though, that what we're witnessing in this country right now, Jim, is millions of low-income, poor women don't have access to reproductive health or abortion. The defunding of Planned Parenthood, which continues apace, is horrific and cruel. So I think we need to, you know, listen, think about the big legal decisions. Brown versus Board. I mean, it took a civil rights movement in the years after Brown versus Board to make it a reality. I think we need now almost underground network, a railroad of women around this country to understand that there's a real link between abortion rights, reproductive rights, economic security, security of family and communities, but make sure that there's support and for women to have that access.
There's also a link between contraception and abortion,
well,
because the right has already voiced opposition.
The right's insane.
Insane.
I mean, it's the contradiction. I mean, they want it all ways and then have it no ways.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not. They're going to fight contraception and
no contraception, more abortion. And
there's a cruelty there. But you know, every person has, you know, a woman in his or her family, I think, and we may see. I think the younger generation, I may be wrong, but certainly I see this on the environmental issue. Evangelicals, the younger generation, more attuned to understanding the need for clean air, clean water, clean planet, and not ready to do the science denial, the denialism that so pervades the Republican Party. But your wisdom on the court is, I mean, the Supreme Court is in a perilous moment and could tip over with the next appointment.
We have so many other issues coming before the court.
I know. Well, that's why I mean, progressives listen. Roe v. Wade is vital. But what progressives didn't realize over these last years is you have labor rights, consumer rights,
gay rights,
civil rights, I mean, you know, all of these rights come before the court.
What about the tension between freedom of religion and constitutional values? I mean, can a baker refuse to cater a gay wedding because it violates his freedom of religion or his or hers? Can a company like Hobby Lobby, that is a profit-making corporation closely held, refuse to give contraception?
I'm going to revert to what I'm going to revert to what I usually revert to when you push me. Four freedoms. The four freedoms. Roosevelt's four freedoms at a different time in this country's history, 1941, but still of resonance and value. The freedom of religion, the freedom to worship, you know, and just to keep religion out of the public sphere. People, we saw this, you know, there was a conflict in Nebraska, the mayoral race. The candidate was, quote, pro-life. I don't like using that term, but he wasn't going to impose his religious views on women or families. I think keep it out of the public sphere is vital. And all of this religious freedom often, in my mind, masquerades for different agendas. And I think it's frightening I mean, this kind of theocratic impulse is not part of our country's best tradition. If I think of the Democrats moving forward, progressives, I think they really need to stand with, quote, the forgotten men and women. I think they need to pursue a...
You know, that was first said by Calvin Coolidge, not
Franklin Roosevelt. I heard Jonathan Alter at a session on the 100 Days, and he brought that up, and people gasped. But you know what? It's a valuable phrase. But I also think we need a kind of inclusive populism. That term gets bandied about, and it's certainly the case that not only in this country but in parts of this world now we're seeing a kind of right-wing populism. But I won't give up on that term. I really think there's a power to it.
The forgotten man at the bottom of the economic...
Women.
At the forgotten, well, Roosevelt said man, but we say men and women.
Yeah, no, we've modernized.
That's right. Times have changed. But I have a question for you, Katrina Van Heuvel, because we've come to the end of our program, and my question is, what can the nation do to push back against the conservative right-wing onslaught?
Well, I think one of what we haven't talked about, Jim, is media malpractice. Media malpractice played a role in 2016 in that election. The failure to cover issues, the focus on pseudo-scandals. What the nation has done through its time is lift up ideas and expose abuses, hold the powerful accountable. And, you know, I think that remains vital in these times, to do the work of real journalism. You know, the word post-truth was coined at the Nation in 1992. Webster's gives us credit. I think we need to continue to try and Tell it like it is.
Tell it like it is.
Tell it like it is.
I'm afraid we've run out of time telling it like it is. But so you must come back, because this has been absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much, Katrina, for coming by. And thank you for coming by, you men and women out there. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.